What if I told you that the real reason France was born had nothing to do with Viking raids or the Frankish king Clovis? Well, in this video, we're going to find out how medieval France was really born. Welcome to my channel. Today, we're off to ask an extremely important question. What if I told you that the real reason France was born had nothing to do with Viking raids or the Frankish king Clovis? Today, we are going to find out how medieval France was really born. This is a special edition of Fake Tank Friday where instead of talking about tanks, we're going to talk about the history of France. There's a common narrative about how the Kingdom of France came to be. In short, it goes like this. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there was a bunch of small kingdoms in what used to be Gaul. These were ruled over by various Germanic people who had invaded and settled there after Rome fell. But then came the Franks under their king Clovis, who went around conquering all of those petty kings and uniting the land under his rule. And then after he died, his successors kept on doing stuff until boom, France. That's a nice story and it's mostly true, but it ignores the fact that while Clovis and the Franks did play a major role in shaping early medieval France, they weren't the first to come into the picture, and they definitely didn't have things completely to themselves. In fact, there was one other major player in the game for southern Gaul, the Visigoths. And in order to understand how medieval France was actually born, we need to take a little detour back to the early 5th century and see just exactly what the heck the Visigoths were doing there. To truly understand the story of how France was born, we have to start off by exploring the identity of the people who were there before the Franks showed up. As we talked about in our last episode, when Rome fell, there wasn't some great migration of the Germanic peoples into Gaul. Instead, people from what we today call Germany migrated into the western provinces of the empire throughout the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The Romans at the time thought of these people as one big mass of barbarians, but in reality, there were many different groups of people migrating into Gaul during this period, including the Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Vandals, and the Suebi, among others. Each of these tribes spoke their own language and had their own customs and traditions, and they would go on to become the so-called founders of the various kingdoms that would eventually make up France. Of all of these different peoples, however, none were more important than the Visigoths. Now, we have an entire episode on the Visigoths coming up soon, so stay tuned for more on them. But in short, the Visigoths were one of the largest and most powerful of the Germanic peoples. They had already established a kingdom of their own in southwestern Gaul by the late 4th century, pushing the other tribes further north. And as the 5th century wore on, they continued to expand their territory into Aquitaine and Septimania, the modern-day regions of southwest France and the eastern coast of Spain. By the middle of the century, they controlled nearly all of southern Gaul, except for the coastal areas held by the Suebi and Burgundians. Even better, because the Visigothic king at the time, Theodemir, was a Catholic, the bishops of the region saw him as a potential ally against the Arianism of the other Germanic tribes. And so in 461, Theodemir was baptized and became the first Visigothic king to convert to Catholicism. This made him very popular with the local Gallo-Roman population, which was overwhelmingly Christian, and thus began a close relationship between the Visigoths and the native people of Gaul that would shape the future of the region. Unfortunately for the Visigoths, though, their control over southern Gaul was soon put to the test. As we discussed in our last episode during the 470s and 480s, the other Germanic tribes they had pushed out of the south. The Burgundians and Suebi, along with the Franks, took advantage of a series of civil wars within the Visigothic kingdom to push back into their territory. By 486, the Visigoths had lost nearly all of their lands in northern Gaul to the Franks, under their king Clovis, and were pushed back into a small corner of southern Gaul around Toulouse. From here, the Visigoths would go on to spend the next century fighting back against the Franks and trying to win back their lost territories. Unfortunately for them, though, they weren't able to accomplish much. While they did manage to push the Franks back at times, they were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Vouillé in 507 by Clovis's successor, Childeric I, and lost even more territory in the process. The Visigothic kingdom was now confined to a small area around Toulouse and Nimes. This is where the story of Clovis and the Frankish conquest of Gaul diverge from the common narrative we mentioned at the beginning of this video. Because as we said, traditionally, it's taught that Clovis united all of the tribes in Gaul under his rule, and that was pretty much the end of that. But in reality, the Visigoths remained a serious political force in southern Gaul for another half-century. Despite their defeats at the hands of the Franks, the Visigoths regrouped and reasserted their dominance in the region. In fact, in 526, the Visigothic king Amalaric even managed to push the Franks out of Aquitaine and retake much of the territory lost at Vouillé. He then went on to conquer the neighboring Burgundian kingdom and subjugate the remaining Germanic tribes in the region, including the Suebi. For the next few decades, southern Gaul was once again united under one banner, but this time, it was the banner of the Visigoths rather than the Franks, and it was one of the most powerful and stable kingdoms in all of Europe. Now, despite this stability, though, there was still unrest in the kingdom. There were constant revolts from the non-Gothic peoples who had been subjugated by Amalaric, and there was also tension between the Arian and Catholic factions within the kingdom. In 536, the Catholics deposed Amalaric and replaced him with his brother-in-law, Theudebert, who converted to Catholicism upon taking the throne. This switch didn't make him any more popular, however, as he spent much of his reign putting down rebellions. In the end, both he and his successor, Theudela, would die in battle against the Franks. And in 558, the Visigothic kingdom was conquered by the Frankish king, Childebert I. Finally, after almost a century of fighting, the Franks had conquered all of Gaul. Except, wait a minute, that's not right either. The Visigoths may have lost control of Gaul, but they didn't go anywhere. In fact, the story of the Visigoths after their expulsion from Gaul is one of the craziest in all of European history. After being driven out of their homeland, the Visigothic royal family fled to Iberia and asked the local Visigothic king, Leovigild, for help in winning back their lost territories. Leovigild agreed, and together with the Visigothic royal family, he waged war against the Franks. While he wasn't able to win back any territory for them, he did at least manage to secure peace with the Franks, establishing a border along the Garonne River, effectively giving the Visigoths sovereignty over all of modern-day France south of that line. Here, the Visigoths would establish their capital at Toulouse and continue on as a powerful kingdom for another 2 centuries. Their culture, language, and laws would all become a major influence on the development of medieval France. And it wasn't until the 730s that they would even acknowledge the Frankish kings as their superiors. So in the end, it was really the Visigoths who were the true founders of France. They were the first to unite the various peoples of the region under one banner. They were the ones who established the foundations of French culture, and they were the ones who fought the wars that allowed the Franks to eventually conquer all of Gaul. So while Clovis and his successors do deserve much of the credit for the creation of France, we can't forget the role that the Visigoths played in the process as well. So there you have it, the true story of how medieval France was born. I hope you enjoyed this special edition of Fake Tank Friday. It's always fun to do something a little different for you guys, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to support the channel even more, consider becoming a member where you can give your input on each episode and get some cool perks while you're at it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.